Hey everybody, how you doing? Good to see you. Glad you could join us. Nikky Lee is here. She's joining us today. Before we begin, I want to go ahead and let you know who Nikky Lee is. And I'm going to start by reading you her bio, if I may, Nikky.
Sure, go for it.
Nikky Lee is an award-winning author who grew up as a barefoot 90s kid in Perth, Western Australia, in a county that I can't pronounce. She now lives in New Zealand with a husband, a dog, and a couch potato cat. In her free time, she writes speculative fiction, often burning the candle at both ends to explore fantastic worlds, mine asteroids, and meet wizards. She's had over 30 stories published in magazines, anthologies, and on the radio. Nikky, thank you so much for coming along, and congratulations on not just one, but two very recent releases.
Yeah, so I stupidly, or maybe strategically,
Or
depending
brilliantly.
yes, decided. So I had the second book in my Rarkyn trilogy come out, and that was last week. And then about 2 weeks before that, I had a collection of short stories come out. Which was a lot of scrambling work all together all at once. So trying to market 2 books at once, don't recommend it, but we managed to make it work.
Speaking of marketing, I want for everybody who's watching, I want you to understand why you should buy these books right up front. And Nikky's gotten very good at pitching her books when she's at live events. So let's do a test. Let's start with Rarkyn's Familiar.
All right. So this is Rarkyn's Familiar. You'll notice a little Rarkyn at the top here. So imagine a girl who accidentally bonds herself to a monster from the other world, realizes the monster's magic is going to turn her insane, and lo and behold, has to quest across the continent to try and find someone to break the cure/curse. And as these things go, nothing goes to plan. So monsters, magic, and shenanigans ensue. And then the book that just came out last week is the follow-up to that series, which is the Rarkyn's Fall. And how to pitch this without giving away spoilers for book 1 is quite difficult.
But basically,
they make it past the mountains is kind of where we start. And they end up in the major city, the city of Mances, trying to find the cure, and some things come out about Lys's legacy, her father, a whole bunch of more shenanigans, more monsters. It's a bit darker, a bit more gory, and someone said it's got a little bit of body horror in it, which I'm like, well, as a sort of a horror writer in the making, that sort of was like, oh, I'll take that. So yeah. And then the last one is A Night So Dark and Full of Stars, which is my bit shiny short story collection, which is all short stories inspired by the Zodiac. So it started off as an anthology series that I was submitting to, and then very quickly managed to get sort of a story for each one. And so maybe the beginning of the year, I decided, hey, would it be cool to try and publish them all together as a collection? And I ended up writing 2 new novellas for that to replace a couple of really short flash fiction pieces, because I imagined that if you were a Virgo and opened your story to your star sign and only had 300 words, you might be a bit miffed. So now we have a sort of a space fantasy and a horror sci-fi novellas in there instead.
One of the things that I really like about you is that you are a polymath in many different areas, not only in terms of writing, because you do several different styles for Night So Dark and Full of Stars. In addition to that, something that people might not know about you is that you are also a staggeringly good athlete. You have represented, what was it? You represented Australia in some sport, canoe polo, right?
Yes, I'm amazed you remembered that.
First of all, what is canoe polo?
So I'm very good at this pitch because I've had to explain it so many times. So imagine kayaks and water polo put together with kind of like the rules of basketball. So you've got like sort of 2-meter goals suspended in the air that you have to try and get the ball into, and you can either throw it or flick it with your paddle. So yeah, it's basically like, netball or basketball in boats with kind of a combination of bumper cars, because you're allowed to like ram people, flip them over, all that sort of fun stuff. So yeah, it's super good.
That's absolutely amazing. Well, in addition to being a phenomenal athlete, you're kind of no slouch as an author. Let's be clear. I can't even go through all the list of accolades that you've received and the awards that you've won. But I do remember there was a story that you told me. It was the Aurealis short story when you were informed about winning on it. Do you want to tell that story real quick?
Oh, this is when I was ordering pizza.
Yeah, we were to shop.
Yeah, so I was standing at, I was in Queenstown on holiday, standing in the pizza shop, ordering a pizza for dinner, and just, scrolling on Twitter as you do, and didn't realize that that's when they would be announcing the award finalists for the Aurealis. And so I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden my son goes ping, 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 ping. And I'm just like, what's going on? Like, what? I didn't post anything. What's happening? And it was that, so they just announced like the short story, the young adult fantasy short story finalists, a bunch of the other finalists. And I'd been nominated, like I'd been shortlisted 6 times. And so I had people going, oh, congratulations, Nikky. And I was just kind of standing there at my phone, sort of at the front of the queue, about to order my pizza, with just my jaw dropped because I just wasn't expecting it at all. And so I think the poor person taking the order and the lady who was then delivering the pizza, I was just kind of sitting there in a bit of a stunned daze. She thought it sounded like I'd received some really bad news or something. No, it was good news.
Well, one of the things that you'd said is that you've won a lot of awards and they mean something to you. But I was reading an interview that you had done where you talked about one of the real benefits of awards is it gives you the confidence to push it further and to take more risks. Like, how do you feel like that's affected your writing journey? And like, can you give some examples of some of those risks that you've taken that you wouldn't necessarily have felt comfortable with when you were 30 or whatever?
So I guess it definitely gives you a lot of confidence. It doesn't like silence that imposter syndrome completely, but it definitely gives you confidence to kind of go, okay, I think I know what I'm doing. And I think one of the biggest things for me was being actually able to decide to self-publish my second book in my Rarkyn series. That was probably like having the awards behind me, having gone through the process and thinking I can probably do this myself without too much trouble. I just have to, obviously, I'm taking on all the creative risk myself, but I also reap all the rewards at the same time. So it's kind of, but that definitely weighed into my decision, thinking that I'm like, okay, I feel confident that I can do that. What else is there? I think in terms of like short stories, especially, is I kind of know that I can trust my gut a bit more. Is like going, okay, my gut is usually right on these things. And if something's not working, it's probably not working. And if I feel something is good, then it's probably good. So I think it's like a lot of that. You're not second guessing yourself as much.
Mhm.
That said, there's probably going to be a dud at some point.
I also feel like unless you've got some of those doubts plaguing you, like those doubts are what make you better as an artist. So
Mm,
you're working hard to avoid that pain of doubting yourself. So you
mm,
keep going back in until it's right and you've got it facing in the right direction. I
yeah.
think if you just walked in full confidence all the time, you'd probably write a really bad story.
Yeah, I think it's that. It's that whole tempered by every time I get like a beta reader or a crit back, and they're like, "Oh, I didn't like this," and you're like, "Oh,
Oh,
well, I
oh.
didn't understand this." Is usually the thing that I get. It's like, "What is this? I don't follow," and I'm like, "Damn, I thought I nailed that, but no."
Oh. I love those notes because it's like anytime when you've thrown the reader off, it's like, okay, hang on, let me tie you to the saddle and make sure you stay in.
Yes.
And like I can keep you in the story. I love knowing where you've lost them a little. It's like, what is going on here? I can't
Yeah,
quite
yeah. Or
picture what
like
you're
I
talking
get
about. Okay, cool.
"You're doing too much action. I'm starting to skim." I was like, "Ah, I'm gonna have to cut my fight scene." Uh,
One of the other stories that you had that I loved, you talked about writing, starting to write when you're 13. And you have a story about drawing on the floor of your grandmother's house. Do you want to share that one?
Yeah, so I think it was like a summer holiday or something like that, and this is, like, back in the how old was I? Like 13, that would have been, like, early 2000s, and not to give away my age or anything. So early 2000s would have been when I was about 13, and so, yeah, it was just one summer, sort of being dropped off at the grandmother's house to be watched, and I ended up just drawing. I was big into anime at the time, so I was drawing, like, anime characters on the floor on a notepad type thing. And then I just drew this character that had I was like telling myself the character story as I was drawing, and it ended up being kind of like I finished the drawing and showed it to grandmother. Oh, very nice, Nikki. And then, but then the story just kept going in my head, and eventually got to the point where I was like, I want to know what happens next, but I can't figure out what happens next because my brain is so focused on trying to hold what I'd figured out, like dreamt up at that point. And so I was like, I need to write it down so then I can figure out what happens. And so I ended up being like, well, writing's the easiest because I'm not good enough at drawing to be able to like draw it. And so yeah, that's kind of how that came about. And so yeah, I think it was within, like, I think I wrote it in a whole summer, which was about 70,000 words for when you're 13. It's like, what?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I think you said it was something like 7 or 8 weeks from the time that you were like, okay, I can't draw this whole thing, to the time that you had a novel.
Yeah. And I was like, I've never written a novel that quick ever again. Like, I think the next quickest one took maybe 4 or 5 years, and that was through uni.
And we've talked about, well, no, actually, I want to do this real quick. With Rarkyn's Familiar, you kind of came at a young adult story, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but my memory says that you do a very good job of creating a human animal bond, let's call it, during the course of this book. And Robin Hobb is one of your big influences. Did the Night Eyes relationship feed into you in any way while you were writing it?
Yeah. So I love Robin Hobb. I'm a little bit behind on her, actually. What I end up doing is waiting for a few books to come out and then just devouring them all at once. I'm kind of like, I'm a binge reader instead of a binge watcher. Is probably how I describe it. And so yeah, that was kind of really influential. I remember reading it through university, and I remember having read, like, I think I almost blew off an exam to read one of her books. So I, instead of studying, I probably spent more time reading. I think it was either The Live Ships or the end of the Assassin Apprentice series. Yeah. And then coming out from that exam, I missed my bus 4 times because every time I looked up, the bus was pulling away, because she just managed to draw me straight back into that story. Yeah, so definitely a favorite, and definitely that relationship between Fitz and Night Eyes was massive influence on this particular book. I was like, if I can write anything even just like a third or half as well, then I figure I'm winning.
Absolutely. One of the things I love about Hobb is that Hobb keeps coming back.
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't matter if it was 96 or 2006 or 2016 or 2026. Hobbs there, and there are always going to be people kind of bringing that up and bringing it back, and I love the fact that it echoes so well. So with Rarkyn's Familiar, you kind of dove into that relationship of the human animal, and then one of the things I was interested about with Rarkyn's Fall, is this the first time that you've included, quote, a touch of romance?
Yeah, so this was so the story behind this was, I'm not very good at writing romance. I fully admit that. And so I was like, all right, let's challenge myself a little bit here. And so I had 2 characters that I was like, I really liked the idea of essentially you have an heir to a kingdom who but then the person who loves her is like just a commoner. And so what do you do in that situation? Is like that's sort of the conundrum. And then to sort of add to more, I guess, tension into the mix is that it's sort of like a sapphic relationship.
Yeah.
And so she's going to have to marry at some point, as the politics of the sort of the land goes, to sort of produce an heir. But what happens if the person that you love is not sort of either the same sex or and also not the same class? So that's kind of where that sort of conundrum kind of came from, and I'm sure it's happened through history, and they've managed it. So yeah, I kind of wanted to explore that a little bit. And the test run, so to speak, was actually a story in this one. I was like, I'll see if I can figure out how to write a romance in a novella, and kind of put it in as a kind of a subplot. And that was the test run then for this book. I do a lot of testing in my short stories to see what works. And then I'm like, okay, I think I can work with that and do more with it in something else.
Well, with Rarkyn's Fall, you've got prison breaks and street brawls and epic battles. You evolve the story. Do you 100% know what you're going to be doing with book 3, or Are you making it up as you go, or is it a combo of the two?
So when I started the Rarkyn Familiar, it was definitely like a massive pantsed book. So I literally was just like riding butts in my pants, and the furthest I could see was kind of like, like a headlight in the distance. That's kind of all I knew where it was going. And then the Rarkyn's Floor, I was like, shoot, I'm turning this into a trilogy. I better know what I'm doing, especially because having written the Rarkyn's Familiar and then trying to write the Rarkyn's Floor, I was like, I can't just wing it because I need to be able to know where it's going for the next book. And I was really conscious of having that middle book slump that I really wanted to try and avoid. Whether I successfully did or not is it's up to the reader to decide that.
We'll let the jury decide.
Yeah, so for this one, I used the Save the Cat, writes a novel plot beats. So that was my outline. And then, but did I stick to the outline? Not really. So I'm one of those like plantser plotsers where it's like I have sort of a rough guidelines, which is very much guidelines, and then it will veer off the beaten track sometimes.
I love that. The blend between the two seems to be a nice place to live. It's like, well, I've got this before I start, and I'm going to change all of that while I'm going. But at least I've got these bones.
Yeah,
tell me the shape of it.
Definitely bones. Yeah, I like that description. It's bones, and then the flesh might grow in weird, chunky bits as we go along, and eventually,
it's got a third arm. Okay, cool. Let's. So, Night So Dark and Full of Stars, I think, is absolutely fascinating. By the way, are you okay? It seems like a lot to release two of these books immediately back to back. I mean, I don't know how the mental energy behind that. How did you pull that off? That's a lot of. I mean, not just making sure that everything's taken care of the right way, but banging the drum and telling people about it and go. I mean, that's a lot.
I think the saving grace for this is that the stories were already written and edited, at least except for the two novellas. But the stories, which I think I started releasing in their anthology, so this was published by Dead Set Press, which is a micro publisher in Australia, and they were releasing these anthologies maybe sort of every couple of months. And so I think it started at the end of 2019 and went all the way through to like 2021, I think, by the time they got through them all. And so they'd already been written and edited. So that was 10 out of the 12 stories done. And then I had the draft of one of the novellas written that was actually meant to be for the Virgo story. And it ended up, I think the word limit was 15,000, and it blew past that. And I was like, bye, so see you later.
Is that We Who Remain?
That is the Maiden's Dawn.
Maiden's Dawn. Okay.
Yeah, and that so that blew past the word count and went, oh shoot, now I have to figure out what else to submit at the time. And then came back, finished that. Once I'd submitted, I kind of just found like a thing I'd written ages ago and went, yeah, cool, that'll do. And somehow managed to get it in. I think because it was short was probably the reason why. So I had this novella sitting here that I didn't know what to do with. And then I ended up just getting it beta read, and then we edited it, and it was fairly smooth. And then the real slog was We Who Remain, which was the one that I had to start from scratch because I knew the Gemini story that I had wasn't long enough to really justify its existence in the collection. So yeah.
That's right. The Maiden's Dawn was the inspired one, and We Who Remain was the slog.
Yeah, the slog, because I made a rod for my own back because I decided that I was going to try and make it like a more hard science fiction to do with like subatomic particles, and I went down the massive research hole, and of course I've got no science background whatsoever. And so trying to actually understand what I was reading on like your research hub, I was like, no. So I ended up kind of landing in a place between where like maybe to like a physicist to be like, oh, this is nonsense, but to anyone that's not a physicist, maybe it sounds plausible. We'll see.
That again, coming back to the polymath thing, I don't know where I want to start with this, so I'm just going to jump in with my first question, which is Night So Dark and Full of Stars. First of all, can you explain kind of the conceit behind this book of how it's based, and then kind of how that came to you and how you grew that from an idea into a series of short stories?
Yes, so each story is based upon one of the star signs, and so there's like obviously the star signs have the elements, the animals, and then there's like the mythology behind it, and so some of them are more loosely based on the star signs than others. And then, so for example, the story for Aquarius, which is like the water bearer, and obviously water is a sort of a strong theme there, but it was a story about sort of a half siren girl who befriends a deaf boy, because I really wanted to show like a disability where the disability is actually a massive advantage. And I was thinking of the story of like Odysseus, and he's listening to the sirens and he gets tied to the mast and all that, and kind of something similar, like a similar take on that, I guess. So there's that kind of that story behind there, and there's some very watery elements in it, is kind of how I would phrase it. And then there's stuff that's more modern in there. So there's one that's Cancer, that's got like a whole bunch of crabs in it. And like these like ancient crabs that live under the sea and various things like that. And this sort of diver sort of stumbles upon them. And then there's like the Aries, which is the ram. That's a story of a girl who's basically got this vendetta against the farm ram, that tries to kind of ram her every time she walks through the paddock to get to school. So there's a mix of everything in there. So there's there's a kind of a sci fantasy, and there's a sort of romance in there. There's quite a sort of elements of horror in most of them.
You've got a scorpion god in there, I think.
Yeah. So, and basically, yeah, so the whole thing, like, so when I wrote all the stories and published them, and I was like, I need to do something with these at some point. And so this sort of at the beginning of the year, I was thinking, oh, maybe I'll put them into a collection. And then because Dead Set Press had done all the work behind it, I kind of was like, it would be really nice to kind of show my thanks to them, because essentially they were what got me publishing on a fairly regular basis, is just writing these stories. Like that's what kickstarted the whole thing, really, is me realizing, oh, hey, maybe I'm okay at this. And kind of giving me the confidence to put more of my work out there. So I definitely felt like I kind of owed them a debt. Like I happily owed them a debt. It's not like I definitely like, so yeah, so I kind of approached the publisher there and said, would you be interested in a collection? They said yes. So that's kind of how that came about. And I sort of said, this is what I'm thinking. And I want to replace 2 of the stories that I wrote earlier with something longer to just kind of beef it out, so it's not sort of this 40,000 word book.
So one of the really interesting things about this is 12 short stories based on the zodiac. Okay, that's a pretty cool idea. You've got this whole kind of panoply in front of you that you can choose from, and you decided, you know what, I'm not done. I'm going to level up one step further, and I'm going to make most of these stories in an entirely different type of fantasy or sci-fi. Like you've dug into a whole bunch of different styles. What was that like? What was hard for you? What was easy? What was the thing that you really enjoyed that you didn't expect? What was the thing that you just hated that you thought you were going to enjoy? Like that's a big staircase to climb. How did you pull that off?
Well, I think because short stories are kind of my place to play and experiment. And so a lot of it is like, I wonder if that will work. Or I really wanted to try writing a story in second person or something like that. So there's a story in there that's second person. That's the Leo story about a lioness who is poached on the plains, and then she gets her vengeance. And then there's another one where I wanted to play with present tense, to write a story in present tense. So I think that was the Taurus story about this hunter in ancient Mesopotamia. And then there's a whole bunch of other ones where for one thing or another, I wanted to try something. And so like, I definitely know that like my preference for short stories is to write something in first person. It just comes so much easier. So that was definitely a lesson that I learned, is first person is my happy place if I need to put, especially if I need to put something out quickly. And then like I found the sci-fi, especially the hard sci-fi, is hard. Unsurprisingly. And that was where I thought We Who Remain, like I had this thing in my head going, oh yeah, it'll be done in like 8,000 words, no problem. And it ended up being sort of a 20,000 word novella. And I thought I could skip around stuff, and I was like, no, I can't. I have to actually explore this a bit more. So that's where that came from.
Well, and some of your inspirations for hard sci-fi, you're a big fan of Andy Weir and Tchaikovsky, because they do hard sci-fi so well. And when you're looking up at those giants, it seems like, even trying to get there seems
but they make it look so easy. And they lull you into this false sense of security, and then you start doing it yourself and you're like, holy cow.
There must be teams of research people working for them at any given point in time. Like Andy Weir's like, I need to know how gravity would work if you were upside down in a parabola around Mars. Okay, here.
Yeah, no, I remember on a writing forum that I'm on, I remember asking for one of the short stories, actually, for Maiden's Dawn, because there's a character in there that's able to do calculus in her head, and this is me who failed year 10 maths. And so I was like, oh, it'd be really cool if I could show the calculations, and kind of went down that route, and quickly got dissuaded from that, because I realized that all the calculus and physics behind sort of like acceleration and the G's that you pull is obviously all based on the Earth's gravity. And I'm like, this is another planet. And like, I was like, I haven't thought about what the gravity of the planet is. It's the planet. It's just, you walk on it and you don't get crushed because of the gravity, and you don't float away either.
It's a great thing about the planet.
Yeah, and so there was all these elements that, like, there was a few physicists that were sitting on or people that had training in physics, and they started questioning this thing, and I'm like, oh, I've gone down a rabbit hole that I don't think I can keep going with this, because I will inevitably undo myself trying to get it right. So I found a way to sort of describe the science without actually talking about the science. And that's my kind of like where I kind of just skim around the outside, because I don't actually know it well enough to be able to get away with it. And my fear is that what would happen is if I put the real science in there, like with the calculations of that, someone would come along and be like, oh, by the way, you got this wrong. And I'm like, I wouldn't know.
It's like, thank you very much for your input. So Martha Wells is another big inspiration for you. Did any of these 12 come out of a Martha Wells type of space?
If
it's no, it's okay.
Yeah, I discovered Martha Wells quite late, actually. It was one of my book clubs found her, and I think it was All Systems Red, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And so I ended up reading all that series and then discovering her Super series, and that was so much an influence and inspiration, like the Rarkyn's in terms of taking it, I guess, to like the next level, is like describing how they operate the building layers, like describing the political systems and societies that of these non-human characters. That's where they came from.
Nice. So then let's talk about horror. So actually, I don't know who your horror inspirations are.
Well,
I've got a list, but none of them are horror.
Yeah, like for me, I kind of consider myself a horror newbie. So I did, for a long time, I was writing it, not realizing I was writing it, until someone kind of pointed out that, this is horror. And I was like, really? And that was a lot of that. These ones ended up being kind of fairly dark and twisty. And I kind of considered, it was just like a dark tone of fantasy. And so when I went, no, that's horror. I'm like, oh, cool. So yeah, so I'm still kind of, I guess what I'd say is like on my horror journey. So like I've read writes of Joe Hill, and a few of the others have escaped me now. But I'm very fortunate to have kind of the New Zealand horror community is very, very close here, which is really good. So there's a couple of horror writers here that do an amazing job of kind of educating, but also kind of I guess inspiring and bringing you through a bunch of things. So Lee Murray is a big one there. So she ran or put together an anthology of sort of emerging horror writers in New Zealand. And so I was invited to be part of that. And that was kind of like a moment is like, oh, I'm a horror writer now. I'm a real boy. So I'm a real horror writer.
Oh, Pinocchio.
Because up until that point, I was like, I kind of just like, I'm like a horror light. And then this time I actually got to kind of fully lean into the horror thing. And I was like, oh no, I can take it a step further and not be scared that I'm going to upset my audience. So yeah, so like I'm still definitely discovering a few. So I think another one was the Maiden Monster was one that I love. Great. A really nice bit of body horror in there too, which kind of makes quietly on your seat. And that kind of was like, okay, so you can do that with body horror, cool. And so yeah, that's kind of where that came from.
Nice. I hate to ask, have you tried King? Is King not something that you would ever consider
I
reading?
this is like confession time here. I've never read a Stephen King,
That's
and
fine.
it's like I have like multiple books of his that I've picked up at like sales, like garage sales, that sort of thing. And I'm like, they're sitting on my shelf, and they just look at me every day that I walk past, and I'm like, one day I'll get to, I promise. Maybe that'll be my Christmas holiday project, is to read a Stephen King novel.
The two I always recommend for introductions to King are Christine and Salem's Lot because they're short, right?
That's
You
a good
don't
idea.
have to
Maybe do some
do
short books.
700 pages. And Christine made him an international success for a reason. And Salem's Lot scared the pants off of me. So it was always seemed like a good place to start. Anything you enjoy after that, fine and dandy. So since you don't read horror much, do you feel like do you do you feel like you really want to tell stories that have that creepy vibe? Is there a place inside of you that's like really gratified by that? Do you like the emotional reaction that you get out of the reader? Do you get to, expel things in your own head by writing that? Like, what's the reasoning for it?
Yeah, I think it's definitely in my own head. So I'm quite like I've been well known to be quite an anxious person, and I feel like this is often something in the case of the many horror writers, not all of us, but some of us, where I feel like it's almost a way to kind of process, and kind of go, okay, like it's almost like that whole anxiety of like of what if, and it's like, well, if I can dream up the worst thing, is then like it can't be worse than anything that I can think of. And it's kind of like it's almost like it's like I'm comfortable writing it because I feel like I'm in the control of it, versus when you're reading it and watching it is you're not in control of it. And so I think so for me as a writer of it, is that's my way of feeling like I can reclaim control, versus when I'm watching it, it's kind of like, okay, I got to learn to let go now and just go with the ride. So yeah, so there's definitely been I'd say that's probably a strong part of it. I think it's just also a lot of it is just like kind of like a weird fascination, is like kind of trying to understand what gets like, because there's horror stories in real life all the time, and you're just like, what does it take to get someone into that frame of mind to do those things? And it's kind of like that, and it's kind of like, I guess I've got sort of a somewhat of addiction to like the true crime TV shows as well. So those are quite fascinating in terms of like I guess um the mental journey that they go through.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, like it's and some of the stuff that happens on that is horrific. And yet at the same time you're drawn to it because you're just like, they can't seriously either think like that or think they'll get away with that. And it's not necessarily the perpetrators of the crime itself. There's a lot of other things going on there as well behind the scenes that you're like, wow, really? So yeah, so it's quite, yeah, I guess it's kind of an exploration of the human condition in a sense, like the really dark human condition. It's like
Right.
understanding how do you get there?
Well, I like the idea with horror that it makes whatever the reality is much less fearsome than what it could be of what you make up on the paper. Two, I love the catharsis of it, right? Because you
Yeah.
get to go through this dark tunnel and you get the emotional catharsis at the end without actually putting yourself in jeopardy, because you've got it here in your hands in the story, and
Yeah,
you can walk away from the book at
exactly. You
any
can just
moment
close it and be like,
you
"Nope, that's enough for tonight. I need to just whew." There's definitely been a few sort of like hair-raising moments of a few things that I read that I was like, "Oh, yep, that's the spine going. Okay, let's just turn the lights back on now,"
yeah.
type thing.
Now try to go to sleep. Have fun.
There's been a few times where I've accidentally read something. So I was reading the anthology I was part of, and there was a few stories in there that I stupidly read just before I was going to sleep, and then I ended up not being able to sleep.
That was exactly my problem with Salem's Lot. Is I started reading it at like 9 o'clock at night, and I got to the point where the bad thing happens like right around 1 a.m. And it was like, well, I'm not going to bed now. So I just read the whole book in one night because it's just like, nope, forget it. I know I'm a little bit over my time, but I did want to ask you. You had said in an article that there was a short story where because you're a short story pro, right? You have been published in many anthologies, and you said that there was one short story in particular that it was Trident's Song, where you felt like that was a moment where you leveled up as a writer. Can you tell me about that a little bit?
I guess so. Like I did a degree in English, and purely because I love to write, not really thinking about career wise what that would lead to. I just knew that I wanted to write, and so I guess Trident Song was almost like a culmination of all the different things that I'd been taught, had read, um, in terms of like trying to find a voice, trying to weave something together that's quite lyrical in a way, that sort of just immerses you fairly quickly off the bat. And that's, yeah, again, first person definitely helps with that. And the inspiration of the story was actually from a creative writing competition prompt, I think, and I wrote the opening line but had no idea where to go with it until the theme of this came along, and I went, I think I can use that. And that's kind of it unfolded from there. So it was more of a pants story than I probably was intending, but it was almost like it just been sitting there waiting to come out. And yeah, but it was definitely a moment where like I was really focused on trying to do all like the word economy, to try and pack meaning without it making it too dense into the sentences. So like clarity, but economy at the same time, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah, so trying to bring all that together to use like your metaphors, your similes, to describe and ground really clearly, like the characters, and the emotional arc that they go through. So I think that was a story where I was really concentrating on sort of bringing and pulling all this together to try and sort of build this story web almost, of all these elements that I wanted to explore. So yeah.
And yeah, it's like watching a field of flowers
Yeah,
blossom.
it is. It is.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. So hopefully you've gotten the idea that Nikky Lee is a pretty accomplished storyteller. And if you're interested in finding out more about these short stories, A Night So Dark and Full of Stars is waiting for you. So please, please, please go out and pick that up today. Today is the day. And if you haven't started Rarkyn's Familiar, the Rarkyn trilogy, please pick that up. And if you have, it's time to move on to the fall. Nikky, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for talking with me. And I'll see you in a little bit.
Awesome. Thank you.